The night had settled in, casting long shadows across the room. Detective Sarah Winters stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the gruesome scene in front of her. The air felt thick with tension and the unmistakable smell of blood. A woman's body lay slumped against the wall, her wide, lifeless eyes staring blankly into the void. Once a beloved figure in the community, now just a cold, empty shell. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly approached the body, gloved hands reaching out to examine the evidence. On the wall, a chilling message was scrawled in fresh blood, each letter jagged and erratic. It wasn't just a murder. It was a deliberate act of betrayal. Her mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of the case. This wouldn't be an ordinary investigation. This was personal. She stepped back and glanced around, her thoughts spiraling. Whoever was responsible for this wasn't just a killer. They had orchestrated a betrayal that ran deeper than she could comprehend. This case would test her in ways she wasn't prepared for. Detective Sarah Winters stepped out of the room, her mind spinning as she absorbed the weight of the scene. The blood on the wall, the chilling message, the victim's vacant stare. It was all a puzzle, and the pieces weren't fitting together. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The moment she stepped into the hallway, Detective Jake Carter joined her, his expression somber. "What's your take?" Jake asked, his voice low and steady, as if he already knew the answer. Sarah glanced back toward the room, her jaw tight. "This isn't random," she said, her eyes narrowing. "It's personal. Whoever did this wanted to send a message. The blood on the wall, it's too deliberate." Jake nodded, understanding her unease. "You think it's someone close to her?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Something about this felt like a twisted game, one that only the killer could fully comprehend. "I don't know," she finally replied, her voice distant. "But I plan to find out." As the two detectives moved toward the elevator, Sarah's thoughts lingered on the victim's face. There was something she hadn't yet figured out, a key detail that would break the case wide open. The investigation moved swiftly, but the more Sarah dug into the victim's life, the more it seemed like everyone had something to hide. The victim, Claire Benson, was well known in the community, a schoolteacher, kind-hearted, beloved by many. But Sarah quickly discovered that Claire had her share of secrets. A hidden bank account. Anonymous messages that she'd kept from her friends and family. Sarah sat at her desk, going over the victim's life, when Jake walked in, holding a folder. "We got something," he said, dropping it onto the table in front of her. Sarah opened it, revealing a series of photos, Claire with a man she didn't recognize, walking out of a building late at night. The pictures were grainy, but there was no mistaking the tension between them. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, pointing at the man. Jake flipped through more photos. "No ID yet, but we're working on it. He was in and out of town a lot. No one at the school knew him." Sarah's mind raced. A secret lover? Or something worse? Jake didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. This was more than just a love affair. This was a potential lead to something much darker. The lead led them to an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town, where the man in the photos had been staying. The air was thick with the smell of mildew as Sarah and Jake walked down the dim hallway, their footsteps echoing off the cracked floor tiles. They approached apartment 3B, the door slightly ajar. Sarah exchanged a glance with Jake before pushing the door open. Inside, the apartment was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a table, and a few scattered belongings. But it was what was on the table that caught their attention, a stack of envelopes, all addressed to Claire Benson, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. Sarah picked up one of the envelopes and turned it over. The return address was from an out-of-state law firm. "Claire was getting legal advice," Sarah muttered. Jake leaned in, his eyes scanning the room. "Looks like someone's been keeping secrets." Sarah's pulse quickened. This could be bigger than we thought. The investigation was taking unexpected turns. What was supposed to be a simple case of murder was now tangled in a web of secrecy, betrayal, and deceit. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Claire had been more involved in something dangerous than anyone realized. The sealed envelope with the return address from the law firm had sent them in a new direction, and now Sarah was standing in the cold, wind-whipped parking lot, staring at the exterior of a downtown law office. This wasn't just a professional connection to Claire, it was a lead that might tie the victim to something far darker. As she stood there contemplating the next step, Jake walked up beside her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah didn't answer immediately, the weight of the case pressing down on her. "I think we're getting closer," she finally said, her eyes fixed on the building ahead. "But I don't know if we're ready for what we're about to uncover." She turned to Jake. "Let's go inside." Detective Sarah Winters sat at her desk, staring at the stack of evidence before her. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the image they painted was disturbing. Claire Benson had been hiding something, and Sarah was now determined to uncover every detail. The bank account, the mysterious photos, the cryptic messages, they all pointed to one thing: Claire had been involved in something far darker than anyone had imagined. But what? As Sarah traced the patterns in the evidence, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ring of her phone. It was Jake. "You need to come down to the morgue," he said, his voice tight. "We've got more information on the victim." Sarah's heart raced. Every new piece of evidence seemed to make the case more complex. I'm on my way," she said, hanging up. She grabbed her coat, feeling a weight settle over her as she prepared to dive deeper into the mystery of Claire Benson's death. At the morgue, Sarah and Jake walked down the sterile, cold hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The scent of disinfectant mixed with the sterile chill of the place. The path to the examination room felt long, each step echoing in the silence. When they reached the door, Sarah braced herself. The morgue attendant stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The body of Claire Benson was laid out on the cold metal table. Sarah's gaze immediately went to her face, but something was different. Claire's expression had shifted since the last time Sarah had seen her. Her lips were slightly parted as if she was trying to say something. The attendant handed Sarah a file. "We found something interesting," he said. Sarah flipped open the file, scanning the autopsy report. "There's a mark on her neck. It doesn't match the initial theory of strangulation," he continued. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the new information. This was no random act of violence. Someone had made sure to leave a message. Back in the office, Sarah sat at her desk, the autopsy report spread out before her. The new information about the mark on Claire's neck didn't add up. She had been strangled, but the mark was too clean, too deliberate. It seemed almost ritualistic. Sarah stared at the report, replaying everything she had learned so far. The photos, the bank account, the law firm, nothing about this made sense. Phone rang again, breaking her focus. It was Jake, sounding urgent. "Sarah, you need to come to the station," he said. "We've got a hit on Claire's phone records. She made a call the night she died, to a burner phone. We think it might be the killer." Sarah's pulse quickened. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, determined to follow this new lead wherever it took her. The station was bustling with activity as Sarah entered, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Jake was waiting by the desk, holding a folder in his hands. "We got the burner phone's location," Jake said, handing her the file. "It was traced to an abandoned building on the edge of town. Looks like we've got a location." Sarah glanced at the file, her eyes narrowing. "Let's go." They made their way to the car, the tension palpable between them. As they drove toward the location, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The building was isolated, surrounded by overgrown grass and a rusting chain-link fence. When they arrived, the area was eerily quiet. Sarah looked at Jake, who nodded in understanding. They drew their weapons and approached the entrance. The door creaked open as they pushed it, the sound of it echoing in the stillness. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence. The inside of the building was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flashlights they held in their hands. The walls were lined with peeling paint and broken windows, the floor littered with debris. They moved cautiously through the halls, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake muttered. Sarah didn't respond. Her focus was sharp. Every step was calculated, every noise amplified in the silence. They reached the end of the hallway and pushed open a door. The room was empty, but something felt off. A small table in the corner had a single photograph resting on it, Claire Benson's face staring back at them. On the back, there was a name written in neat handwriting, David. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. David, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Was this the person behind it all? Before she could process it further, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the building. "We've got company," Jake said, his voice tense. The chase was on. The investigation was taking a darker turn. Detective Sarah Winters paced around her office, trying to piece together the latest revelations. David, Claire Benson's connection, was no random name. He was the key, the one that kept appearing in the shadows. Jake had tracked him to a private apartment downtown, one with no apparent history. No criminal records, no connections to Claire other than the mysterious photograph. Sarah sat down, staring at the file in front of her, her fingers tapping the table. The more she dug into David's life, the more questions piled up. Why would Claire, an innocent, seemingly gentle woman, be involved with someone like him? What was the real nature of their relationship? Sarah wasn't sure anymore. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces seemed to fit into a web of deception and betrayal. Claire's life had been a lie, and now it seemed the truth would cost her everything. As Sarah ran through the possible scenarios in her mind, her phone rang. It was Jake. "We found something new. Come to the apartment, now." She grabbed her coat, her heart racing. It felt like they were closing in on the killer. But would they be in time? Sarah and Jake arrived at the downtown apartment, its exterior as nondescript as the rest of the neighborhood. The building loomed above them, silent and dark. Jake pulled up in front of the door and turned to Sarah. "This is it," he said. "This is where David's been hiding." Sarah surveyed the building, her eyes narrowing. It was old, with peeling paint and cracked windows. The area looked forgotten by time, and yet this was where they were about to uncover the answers they had been chasing. The tension between Sarah and Jake was palpable as they made their way inside. The hallway smelled musty, and the flickering light overhead cast eerie shadows on the walls. They approached apartment 3A. Jake knocked once, and they waited, their weapons ready. Silence. Then, a loud crash from inside, followed by a door creaking open slowly. Sarah's heart pounded as she motioned for Jake to follow her in. They pushed the door open. Inside, the apartment was disturbingly quiet, save for the sound of something, or someone, moving in the shadows. The door creaked open, and the two detectives stepped inside, weapons drawn. The apartment was eerily quiet, with a faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. Sarah scanned the room, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was sparsely furnished, with only a small table and a couch near the wall. The only notable detail was a photograph, Claire Benson's face, framed and sitting on the coffee table. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was more than just a hiding place, it was a message. As Sarah moved toward the table to pick up the photo, she noticed something else, David's personal effects scattered across the room, from empty liquor bottles to a small safe partially hidden beneath the couch. "This doesn't feel right," Jake whispered, his eyes darting around the room. Just then, they heard a faint sound coming from the back of the apartment, a slow, deliberate footstep, followed by another. Someone was here. Sarah held up her hand to stop Jake, and they moved silently toward the source of the sound. The closer they got, the heavier the air felt, charged with danger. They reached the doorway and paused. The tension was unbearable. The room was tense as Sarah and Jake approached the back hallway. The faint sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Sarah motioned for Jake to stay back as she moved toward the door at the end of the hall. Her heart raced. What were they about to find? She pushed the door open slowly, her breath shallow, every muscle in her body coiled with anticipation. The room inside was dark, lit only by a small lamp in the corner. But then, Sarah's flashlight caught something in the corner of the room. A figure standing motionless, facing away from them. A man. David. His back was to them, and he didn't seem to hear their approach. The silence was shattered when Sarah called out, "David!" He turned abruptly, his face pale but hard, his eyes filled with a cold recognition. Before Sarah could react, he reached for something hidden behind him. "Don't come any closer," he warned, his voice low and steady. The tension in the air thickened, and Sarah and Jake both tightened their grips on their weapons. It was clear now, David wasn't going down without a fight. David took a step back, his hands still hovering near the object behind him. "You think you know everything, but you don't," he sneered. Sarah's voice was calm, but her words carried authority. "Put your hands where I can see them. We're not here to play games." David smirked, shaking his head slowly. "You really think it's that easy?" Before Sarah could respond, the sound of a car engine starting outside echoed through the window. David's smirk vanished as his eyes darted toward the exit. He made a sudden move, rushing toward the door. Sarah reacted instantly, sprinting after him. The chase was on. As David burst through the door, he glanced back, just as Sarah lunged forward to grab him. The door slammed behind them and the pursuit took to the streets. Sarah could hear the pounding of her own heart as her footsteps matched David's. He was fast, but she was faster. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. David's sudden move toward the door sent Sarah into action. She sprinted after him, her feet pounding against the pavement as the chase moved out into the streets. He was fast, but Sarah's focus was sharper. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she closed the distance. David glanced back over his shoulder, panic flickering in his eyes. Sarah's pace quickened. "Stop right there," she shouted, but he didn't listen. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he darted into an alley, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't slow down. The alley was narrow, the walls closing in as she chased him deeper into the darkened passage. She had him in her sights now, and nothing was going to stop her from bringing him in. Sarah pushed through the alley, but David was gaining distance. The echo of his footsteps was growing fainter, and her frustration mounted. "I'm not letting you get away," she muttered under her breath. David turned another corner, and Sarah followed. As she rounded it, she found herself face to face with an old, abandoned warehouse. The door was ajar, and she hesitated. Was this a trap? But there was no time for second guessing. She stepped forward, her hand on her weapon, as she carefully approached the entrance. She could hear David's breathing inside, and the feeling of danger grew stronger. She motioned to Jake, who had just caught up with her. Together they slowly pushed the door open, stepping into the unknown. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rotting wood. The dim light from outside barely pierced through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Sarah's heart beat faster as they moved deeper into the warehouse. Every creak and groan of the building seemed amplified in the heavy silence. Then, from the far corner of the room, she heard it. Soft footsteps. "David." Sarah raised her flashlight, and the beam swept across the room, landing on his figure standing near an old metal crate. He turned, his eyes wild. "You don't understand," he spat. "It's too late now." Before Sarah could respond, he lunged, knocking over a stack of crates. The noise was deafening. Jake shouted for Sarah to move, but it was too late. David was already running again, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. David darted into the shadows, vanishing behind a stack of crates. Sarah moved swiftly, her steps light as she tried to anticipate his next move. The warehouse was a maze of rusted machinery and forgotten goods, every corner filled with hiding spots. "Stay close," she whispered to Jake, but he was already moving ahead. Sarah's eyes scanned every dark corner, every crevice in the walls. As she moved further into the warehouse, a low growl broke the silence. A pack of stray dogs, once hidden in the shadows, emerged and started barking, charging towards Sarah. She instinctively raised her gun, but a shot rang out. Jake had already taken action. The dogs scattered, but the noise had drawn more attention than they anticipated. Sarah's instincts told her to move faster. "We need to finish this now," she said, her voice cold and determined. As the dogs scattered, Sarah and Jake pushed forward, their steps quickening. They moved deeper into the heart of the warehouse, where the final confrontation awaited. They reached a loading dock, and David was cornered. He turned to face them, his chest heaving with exertion. "You won't take me down," he yelled, his voice desperate. This was never supposed to happen. His hands shook as he reached for something behind his back. Sarah's heart raced. He was armed. "Don't make this worse, David," she called out. "Just give yourself up." But he raised the weapon, and in that moment, everything slowed. Sarah didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, she fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the warehouse. David fell to the ground, the weapon clattering from his hand. Sarah stood over him, her breath heavy, her heart pounding. The danger was over, but the price had been high. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in Sarah's ears, as she stood over David's lifeless body. The weight of the moment was heavy, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The man who had caused so much destruction was finally neutralized, but there was no sense of relief. His life ended, but it didn't bring closure. Jake approached her cautiously, his eyes lingering on the body. "It's over," he said quietly, but Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. The anger, the confusion, none of it was resolved by his death. In the end, David had been a victim of his own choices, just like Claire. "We'll get justice for her," Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Justice didn't feel like enough, though. There was a deeper pain inside her, one she didn't know how to heal. But she had to keep going, for Claire, for herself, for the victims who never got to speak their truth. Back at the precinct, the case files were finally being closed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. "We've done our job," Jake said as he handed her the final report, but his words felt hollow. Sarah stared at the report, but her mind wasn't focused on the words. It was on Claire's face, the photograph that had haunted her for days. "I still don't understand," Sarah muttered, her eyes moving between the files on her desk. Why was Claire involved with someone like him? What did she really know? Jake sat across from her, his voice soft but firm. "You can't blame yourself for her choices, Sarah. You did everything you could." Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. There was something about this case that didn't sit right, something that felt unfinished, even with David dead. She knew that, despite the finality of his death, her work wasn't done. Not yet. The next day, Sarah drove through the quiet streets, her thoughts still on the case. She had been over every detail, but something nagged at her. The mysterious connections, the unanswered questions. It was all pointing to one thing. There was more to Claire's death than anyone realized. Sarah parked in front of Claire's former apartment building, staring up at the windows. Claire had lived here, in the same place where the secrets had been kept. Sarah took a deep breath and walked inside, determined to find the missing pieces. As she entered the apartment, the silence was overwhelming. The air felt thick with the memories of what had happened here. She approached the small desk by the window, her hand brushing over the surface. There she found it, a hidden letter, tucked between the pages of an old book. She opened it, her eyes scanning the words. It was a letter to someone. To David. Her heart raced as she read the words. "I'm scared. I don't know who to trust anymore." Sarah read the letter over and over, her mind racing. The words were clear now. Claire had been terrified. She had been caught in something much bigger than herself. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pieced together the final moments of Claire's life. David wasn't just a victim, he was a manipulator. He had dragged Claire into this web of lies, and she had been too scared to escape. Sarah stood up, her mind made up. "I can't let this go," she said quietly, her voice filled with determination. "I won't let Claire's story end like this." Jake arrived at the door, his face grim. "What's going on?" Sarah turned to him, holding up the letter. "We missed something," There's still someone out there. We need to find them before they disappear. Jake nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. Let's do it. They had a new lead, and Sarah wasn't going to stop until she found the truth, no matter what it took. Sarah and Jake arrived at the new location, a small, secluded cabin outside the city. The place looked abandoned, hidden from view. But Sarah had a feeling this was where the answers lay. She stepped out of the car, her gun in hand, ready for whatever they would find. They moved cautiously toward the cabin, every sense heightened. The wind rustled the trees, and the air smelled of pine. As they approached, they heard a faint sound coming from inside, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Sarah motioned for Jake to stay back, then slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The place was dark, but they could make out two figures standing in the corner. The light from their flashlights illuminated their faces. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized one of them, the missing link. The one person who had been pulling the strings all along. The confrontation was imminent, and Sarah knew there was no turning back now. Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin, her heart pounding. The two figures inside remained still, their eyes locked on her. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of the truth about to be revealed. Jake stood beside her, equally focused, his hand on his weapon. "We know what you did," Sarah said, her voice steady but commanding. The figure in the corner, the one pulling the strings all along, finally spoke. "You think you've won, but you don't understand." His words dripped with arrogance. Sarah's gaze hardened. "Tell us everything now. The game is over." Silence fell between them, only the sound of their breaths breaking the stillness. The figure stepped forward, eyes narrowed, and finally he began to speak, revealing a deeper conspiracy than Sarah could have ever anticipated. The man in the corner finally spoke, his voice laced with frustration. "You think you've pieced it all together, but there's so much more you don't know. Claire didn't just get caught up in this, she was part of it." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the information. She had suspected there was more to the story, but this was a twist she hadn't anticipated. "You're saying she knew?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The man nodded. "She knew everything. The deals, the manipulation. She was as much a part of it as anyone." Jake stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Then, why kill her?" The man smirked. "She was a liability. She started asking too many questions." Sarah's heart sank. Claire hadn't been a victim at all. She had been part of the lie from the beginning. The weight of the revelation sank in. Sarah felt a mix of anger and betrayal as she stared at the man in front of her. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man smiled coldly. "You want justice, but there's no one left to give it to you." He moved toward the back of the cabin, and Sarah tensed, anticipating his next move. The sudden sound of a door slamming shut from the back of the cabin startled them. Sarah spun around, her weapon raised, but the room was empty. The man had disappeared, leaving behind only a cryptic message scrawled on the wall in blood. Sarah's stomach twisted as she read the words. "You're too late." Sarah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "We've lost him," she muttered, frustration in her voice. "But we're not done yet," Jake said, his tone resolute. "There's still a way to finish this." Sarah looked at him, determination reigniting in her chest. "We'll find him, no matter where he's gone." With that, they left the cabin, stepping back into the cold night air. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the path ahead. Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of how to track down their quarry, but there was no time to waste. They had to act fast. Every minute lost was another step closer to the killer slipping through their fingers. The final chapter of this case was still unfolding, and Sarah wasn't going to let it slip away. The chase led them to a remote part of the city, where the streets grew darker and quieter. Sarah knew they were getting close. "This is it," she said, stopping in front of an old abandoned warehouse. The building loomed before them, its windows shattered, and walls covered in graffiti. Sarah motioned to Jake, signaling for him to stay back as she approached. The air felt thick with tension, and every step echoed in the silence. She knew that inside that warehouse was the man who had masterminded everything. She could feel it in her bones. As she reached the entrance, she paused. "Ready?" Jake asked. Sarah nodded, determination in her eyes. "This ends tonight." Sarah stood in front of the warehouse, the dim moonlight casting an eerie glow across the structure. Inside, she knew, was the truth they had been hunting for. The man behind it all. She turned to Jake. "This ends tonight." Jake nodded, his expression cold, his hand on his weapon. They both knew there was no going back. The chase had brought them here, to this final confrontation. Sarah's breath was steady as she took a step forward, her gaze locked on the door. They had fought through lies, manipulation, and death to get here. But the hardest part was yet to come. Sarah could feel the tension building in her chest as she reached for the door. "Stay close," she whispered to Jake. With one final push, they entered. The darkness inside swallowed them, and they knew they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust and silence. Sarah's flashlight sliced through the darkness, revealing scattered crates and old machinery. Each step felt like a ticking clock. They had no idea where the man was hiding, but Sarah could feel his presence, somewhere just beyond their reach. The silence was broken by a faint sound, a shuffle in the distance. Sarah froze. Jake nodded, signaling to move cautiously. Every corner they rounded seemed to close in, heightening their sense of danger. The man was here somewhere, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Sarah's grip tightened around her flashlight, but she didn't falter. "We're getting close," she whispered. Her voice was the only sound in the vast empty space. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There he was. The man they had been hunting. His face was partially obscured, but his smirk was unmistakable. "You're too late," he sneered, his voice echoing through the warehouse. Sarah's anger flared, but she kept her cool. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady. He stepped forward, revealing a gun in his hand. "I don't think you understand. There's no escaping what's coming." Sarah's pulse quickened. The standoff was inevitable. The man raised the weapon, and Sarah reacted instantly, firing a single shot. The silence that followed was deafening. The man collapsed to the ground, his gun slipping from his hand. But something didn't feel right. This wasn't the end, not yet. Sarah moved cautiously toward the fallen man, but as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of terror. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You've only scratched the surface." His words sent a chill through Sarah. Before she could respond, a loud crash came from behind her. Sarah spun around, her gun raised. Jake was already in motion, rushing toward the sound. The floor beneath them shifted, and the entire warehouse seemed to groan as if something larger was awakening. Sarah's instincts screamed that they weren't alone. "Get out!" the man shouted one last time, but it was too late. The trap had been set, and they were now caught in it. Sarah and Jake raced to the exit, their footsteps echoing in the vast crumbling warehouse. The building was shaking now, the sound of metal grinding against metal reverberating in their ears. "This isn't just a trap," Sarah muttered, her voice full of realization. "It's a countdown." The walls seemed to close in as they ran. They reached the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah slammed her shoulder against it, desperate. Finally, it gave way, and they burst into the cold night air. But as they turned to look back, the warehouse erupted in a burst of light. The explosion was deafening. Sarah's heart raced as they stumbled away from the blast. The case was over, but the echoes of the explosion would stay with her forever.